Good morning. Hey, Willie. We're going to go ahead and get started so we can get started on time. So welcome to the convention. I think several of you have been here over the last couple of days, or at least yesterday, for some of the courses, which I'll explain. I'm going to do a quick kickoff and then turn it over to our two presenters. So my name is Jake Player. I'm the chair of the electronics division for ISRI. And I want to welcome you to the convention. If you just got here, I got in last night, so this is exciting. We're going to hear from Andrea and Erica, and I'll introduce them right when I finish. I'm going to give a quick overview of the week of what we should expect from the sessions as a quick kickoff. So first, a little bit about the division. There are a little over 400 companies in the electronics division, or at least companies that are processing electronic materials. So it's a significant number of companies. I've heard that this convention attendees is also very high, almost mirroring last year's, which is a record. We have, over the last year, done a lot of work with 5 different committees for the electronics division. We have the Certification and Standards Committee, the Education and Conference Programs Committee, the Recycling Services Committee, the Definition and Specs Committee, and the Legislative and Regulatory Committee. I wanted to especially thank the Education and Conference Programs Committee for the work that they've done in preparing the agenda for this week for our track. And our track is actually the Electronics Recycling Summit. So when you think about the brochures, or at least in your programs, that's the track that we're going to follow. When we look at what we're going to do this week, we'll start with what happened yesterday. We had 2 courses on the electronics recycling fundamentals, and that was moderated by Peter Benison, so thank you to Peter for doing that. And then the second course was the R2 Rios training course, and it was moderated by Tracy Blazak, so thank you, Tracy, for that. I will say that we've seen a tremendous uptick in R2 certified companies. I want to get these right. We have 352 certified facilities to R2. It's pretty significant. I was just talking to Joe Clayton in the hall right before this session and saying 2 years ago at this convention we were talking about standards really becoming an important issue for the industry and how it was critical that companies adopt or at least get to know about these standards. So that's huge. 352 facilities certified, and 73 of those are R2 Rios certified. Additionally, I heard the pipeline for companies and facilities being or in the pipeline to be certified is also very significant, over 200. So the industry's really adopted the certifications. And actually, the training has been going on for almost 5 years, this course. And there's been approximately 1,000 people trained through these courses. So congratulations to them on those training courses. So let me quickly go through the rest of the week. Today, we have 3 sessions. This session. Immediately following this session, we have our Spotlight on Electronics, which I'm moderating, and this is an exciting topic. This is a venture capital perspective on the electronic recycling industry. It's really going to talk about some of the recent consolidation that we've seen. Maybe not even recent. I mean, the last sort of 4 years, we've seen a lot of capital activity around this industry, and we've got a great panelist set up, so I would encourage everyone to attend that. The panelists are from world-class companies, from, I'd say, probably the best-known VC in the world, Kleiner Perkins. We've got a representative from a large PE firm, Golden Gate Capital. We've got Catterton Partners, who was a large PE firm out of New York that was actually invested in my former company. We've also got Rob Schaefer, from Gartner. He's going to be on that panel as well, and he produces the Magic Quadrant, which several of you know about, which is a good industry overview and highlights some of the companies in our industry. So that's at 11:30 to 12:15. I will let you know, unfortunately, I'm going to jump out of here a little early to run over there and try to babysit some of the panelists as they get in and we get them set up. And then this afternoon, we have a session on how to handle recycling material responsibly, and that is hosted by Jim Levine. Let's see. Okay. Finally, on Friday, we have a global summit on electronic recyclers. We've got representatives, I think, from India, China, and Mexico. That's being hosted by Todd DeLay. And then following that session, tomorrow we have Maximizing Value in Electronic Recycling. That is moderated by Bill Long. So with that, let me introduce Erica. So Erica Ranased is a commodity analyst with CPM Group. She specializes in precious metals, market research analyst, and strategic planning. She's responsible for building the group's supply and demand statistics for precious metals, their yearbooks, their long-term reports, and special reports. She is currently closely monitoring silver and platinum markets. She regularly presents the group's market views at conferences and seminars around the world. She holds a bachelor's from Fordham University's Gabrielli School of Business. So welcome, Erica. I gotta get your presentation here. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm really excited to be speaking today because I've put together a lot of new research for CPM Group on electronics recycling as it pertains to precious metals. And today will be one of the first few times that I've presented on it. So if anyone finds any of this work interesting, please come up to me afterwards so we can discuss a little bit further, and I'd love some feedback as well. So first I'll be starting out talking a little bit about our views on the precious metals markets. First and foremost, it's all about value in the recycling industry, especially as it pertains to those products that contain high value or high quantities of precious metals. And then I will talk about electronics recycling of precious metals and our outlook on that front. So for gold and silver, what we expect is that in 2011, we saw a peak in those prices. And that we're going to see a bit of consolidation over the next couple of years, and then we'll continue to see prices move higher sometime around 2015, 2016. So what we call this is a cyclical peak in a secular bull market. We still believe that precious metals prices, particularly gold and silver, will remain at elevated levels by historic standards, and although we expect some declines over the next few years, we can see them continue to rise beyond 2015. The precious metals markets are in what we would call a new market today relative to the 1990s and the 1980s. We've seen record volumes of investment demand. For gold, we've seen investment demand north of 20 million ounces per annum since the turn of the century. And for silver, we saw investment demand return to positive, in which investors were buying net large amounts of silver as of 2006, and we expect this to remain the case, that investors will continue to buy large volumes of silver rather than selling it. So if you look at this chart for silver, in all of the 1990s and much of the first half of the 2000s, investors were selling silver into the market. So they were essentially providing fabricators with their metal requirements when supply from mine production and recycling fell short. So as we've seen prices increase over the past decade, there's been a shift in the growth of supply. Mine producers have expanded their capital expansion plans. They've been rapidly ramping up volume output over the past decade, and we expect a lot of that capacity expansion that has been taking place over the past decade to filter into the near term and the medium term, in which we'll see some very positive growth in mine production, but also in secondary supply, given the much higher prices relative to even a decade ago. So demand for precious metals takes the form of three components in which prices affect demand differently. So first, you have investment demand, and investment demand will drive prices. That will dictate prices higher or lower based on investor sentiment toward the metal and the market and the global economy. Then you have the price-sensitive component of jewelry. Jewelry demand will rise when the price declines, or if the price remains less volatile relative to recent years. And then you have industrial demand, and that is largely price insensitive. For gold and silver, we expect very strong increases in fabrication demand. Fabrication demand is comprised of industrial demand and jewelry demand, and this is mostly because we expect strong increases in jewelry demand. While we don't expect prices for gold and silver to decline significantly, we do expect some consolidation, and that will be positive for jewelry demand. That coupled with the fact that consumers are largely adjusted to the much higher price environment of today than they were over the past decade as prices were rapidly rising. So I'm going to kind of gloss over PGMs, but it is another important component of the precious metals story. PGMs are a completely different story relative to gold and silver. Platinum group metals are mostly used in the auto industry for the reduction of harmful emissions from auto vehicles. And what we believe is that platinum, palladium, and even rhodium, which I don't really feature in this presentation, the prices will rise because the fabrication demand expectation is very strong. We expect very strong growth in demand going forward, and that is largely price inelastic. Most of the demand for PGMs is industrial. There's very little component for palladium and rhodium in jewelry, and for platinum, there's about 25% demand. It comes from jewelry, so there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of the demand profile there. But going forward, we expect prices for platinum, palladium to rise over the near term and even in the long term. So on top of a very strong demand profile, we have very slim expectations for growth in supply. On the mine production side, about 40 to 50% of all PGMs are produced in South Africa, and there are a lot of inherent risks in producing these metals in South Africa. So the main risk is you have a lot of labor issues. Last year is a prime example of this when the top 3 platinum producers in the world experienced multi-week mine closures due to labor strikes. This resulted in a double-digit decline in mine production of platinum, palladium, and rhodium. So going forward, about 80 to 90% of the capacity expansion in the PGM market for supply is expected to come from South Africa, and because there's such high risk when it comes to producing PGMs in South Africa, this 1.2% annual growth over the next 5 years could very well be reduced to even lower. So very constrained supply expectations going forward. And as I mentioned before, we expect a very structural increase in demand. A lot of the demand components for PGMs are price inelastic, except when you look at platinum, which has a much larger jewelry component. But even when you look at platinum and jewelry, much of the jewelry that is platinum jewelry demanded in the world comes from China. And Chinese growth for platinum jewelry has been rising more as a function of higher disposable incomes as opposed to a function of price of the metal. So secondary supply of the precious metals, in volume terms, most of it is silver. Very obvious reasons. There's about almost 1 billion ounces of silver produced annually. So there's a lot more silver if you look at it relative to the other precious metals. But in value terms, it's important to say that gold is king. So when you look at electronics recycling and the precious metals value in those electronics, there are certain electronics where 80, 90% of the value is derived from precious metals, and half of that or more is derived from gold. So the value will really dictate what gets recycled, as opposed to the volume. So sources of secondary supply include jewelry, silverware, decorative items. For the platinum group metals, it's auto catalysts. Electronics, you got a host of products in the electronics sector. Dental restorations, that's been declining for some time. Solders, biocide materials, and a host of other products that come into the recycling circuit. Now, there are different factors that affect different sources of secondary supply. Prices is the factor that affects all sources of supply. So for precious metals, given that precious metals prices are much higher than they were in previous decades, the recycling market has really shifted higher and is expected to continue to shift higher going forward. Product lifespans is really mostly important for things like auto catalysts and the electronics. Electronics, they all have different lifespans and they vary from region to region, country to country, within countries. And then if you look at income growth and unemployment levels, that will mostly actually affect jewelry secondary supply. Market penetration replacement trends in the developed markets, replacement trends are key. In the developing economies, market penetration is key. So if you look at auto catalysts coming out of China, there really isn't much volume there because emission standards only began in the turn of the century. Whereas in Japan, there have been emission standards since a little after the US, after the 70s, and so there's very high volume there. Recycling capacity is a major thing, and that can also be very much dictated by regulations and legislation. Recycling capacity is there capacity to recycle that product? Every product, especially when it comes to the electronics sector, will require different methods, different processes to extract the value out of it. And some regions just simply don't have that capacity, or there's no incentive to create that capacity. Maybe the market doesn't perceive value to develop capacity there. And sometimes that will be forced in through regulations. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the electronics recycling market, and first I'll start off with, each electronic item product has different value, and when you look at the value in terms of gold, low value would include things like cordless phones, calculators, TVs. Medium value, that's some other mobile phones, laptops, handheld computers. High value, and that's what's actually getting most recycled and refined today, is the circuit boards, mobile phones, mostly smartphones, integrated circuits, and multi-layer ceramic capacitors. Okay, so what I did with breaking out electronics demand for the precious metals is I took the most high-value products, and that most high-value products in terms of precious metals value is mobile phones, computers, and tablets. Tablets has the most prospect of growth, but will only ever take a marginal slice of the pie. Mobile phones has the most potential for growth in terms of value. And then computers, we expect growth, but we expect growth to slow relative to the past 2 decades. So if you look here, you can see that most of the demand for electronics in terms of precious metals value comes from computers and mobile phones. Other takes place, is comprised of all those lower value products where there's less precious metal value. So for platinum and palladium, it's a bit different. Platinum, a lot of the demand from the electronics industry comes from hard disks and other smaller products, which I haven't disaggregated here. But you can see that for palladium, a lot of it comes from mobile phones. That's really the king for palladium. Okay, so an important factor to consider in terms of the value of recycling precious metals from electronics waste is thrifting. Thrifting in the industry is an ongoing phenomenon. Thrifting is always occurring. Manufacturers are always looking for ways to reduce the precious metals content because that's the highest value of their cost profile in production of electronics items in many cases. And here is an example of thrifting activity over the past 2 decades. If you look at mobile phones, what I've done is I've compiled a couple of data points for a few years and estimated what the thrifting of precious metals has been. And overall, in the past two decades, there's been about a 3.1% annual rate of precious metals reduction per mobile phone. And what this is manufacturers are finding ways to reduce the amount through different technological innovation. That may be using nanotechnology or finding ways to reduce the precious metal in paste by implementing other metals. But the key is that you need to preserve the reliability, and as electronic items become smaller and smaller, minimization, reliability becomes more and more important. So eventually what we expect is the thrift rate for different products, like if you look at mobile phones, the mobile phone market has tremendous growth potential, but the technology, until it changes further, there probably isn't as much thrift potential going forward. The technology is much more known. It was rapidly developed in the 80s and then the 90s, and then now everyone has a mobile phone. And so the market is a lot more mature than it was 2 decades ago. There's a lot more thrifting activity because reliability was becoming more and more understood. And so going forward, while we do expect more thrifting activity, it may not be at that 3.1% rate. But when you look at other electronics products like the tablets. That's a brand new market. Only in the past few years have tablets really been commercially used. There might be a lot more thrifting potential there, and that can affect the economics of recycling those products. Okay, so this chart shows the breakdown of recycling capacity of electronic waste, and it's determined by an integrated process. So it includes the capacity for smelting, recycling, and refining precious metals from electronics waste. So while I'm aware that there's probably smelting capacity in one area and refining capacity in another region, what I've done is I've taken a look at what's the integrated capacity and capability of refining precious metals from electronics. And most of it's in Europe. Europe has the most mature regulatory infrastructure for e-waste, and it's becoming more and more stringent. So there is a bit more capacity there. Canada comes next, then Japan. And while the US has a lot of different capacities, there's really no integrated capacity for e-waste recycling, for precious metals value, that is. Okay, so this image I have taken from Boliden, and this is what they're saying is the e-scrap smelting versus potential for e-scrap smelting. And what they've determined is, Europe has the most mature smelting capacity for e-scrap. And then if you look at other areas, the US has the largest potential feedstock, and China also has very large feedstock, but not much smelting capacity either. So the US accounts for 20% of computer sales, accounts for a large percent of mobile phone sales. It's a very large electronics market. And so there's a lot of value and potential to feed into an electronics recycling industry, which, is rightfully exacted. Okay, so here I'm going to get into some projections and expectations, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the factors that I've included here. Going forward, we expect a 2% annual growth over the next 10 years in precious metals demand from the electronics sector. This takes into account our expectations, our very conservative expectations for growth in different product industries. It takes into account what we expect for thrifting of the metal in these industries. And compiling all of that, this is what we would expect. For the tablet market, we expect the strongest double-digit growth in product demand, but at the same time, it'll only ever be a marginal component of electronics demand. Computers, we expect strong growth, but it's expected to be slower than over the past decade. A lot of that is because you're getting tablets commanding a larger share of the computer market. And then mobile phones, we expect the strongest growth. So mobile phones, if you look at developing nations, a lot of those consumers, instead of buying computers, are completely moving past computers and just buying phones with internet capability so that they don't even need a computer. So that's where we expect the strongest growth there. And just to point out, mobile phones actually have the largest silver value and very high gold value. Okay, so getting a little bit more detailed about the factors that we're considering in demand for precious metals from the electronics industry. Thrift rates are really important, as I highlighted before. The potential for new product markets is just simply very difficult to determine what is the new product going to be and what will be the precious metals content and how will that affect other product markets. In the case of tablets, you're seeing that computer demand is declining because consumers are now moving toward tablets and replacing less of their computers. So in a household of 3 computers with 3 computer users, they may use 1 computer and have 3, 4 tablets. So it's just a different world today as it was 5 years ago for that. So that could happen again. Effective recycling. So when it comes to e-scrap recycling for precious metals value, what is the effective rate? So an example is in China, there's a lot of illegal smelting and recycling of electronic waste, and that can be very hazardous because of the hazardous material in it. And then you get a lot of, another example for China is that a lot of those products don't actually get recycled ever. They go into landfill, or they get exported to other markets. In the case of US, a lot of them can get exported to other markets as well. And Europe also, a lot of electronic waste will either go into landfill or it can be exported to countries in Africa. So what is the real, what is the theoretical rate or feedstock to electronic recyclers versus what is actually coming to those recyclers? Okay. So considering all these factors, the real effective recycling rate, thrift rates, growth in different product industries, taking in all those different factors, which are highly variable, lifespans as well, we've factored in all of these. We've been very conservative, and what we expect is about a 5.7% growth in precious metals output from e-scrap recycling. That's very strong growth, and that's even higher growth than we're expecting in overall secondary supply for gold and silver. For platinum and palladium, we actually expect very, very strong growth in secondary supply, a bit stronger than 5.7%, but as I mentioned before, gold and silver are the real kings for extracting value of precious metals and electronics supply. So going forward, we expect a 5.7% rate, and that's concluding my presentation.
Thank you, Erica. And I think we'll have hopefully some time for questions after Andrea presents. So let me introduce Andrea. Let me pull up the slides real quick. So Andrea Boren is an analyst with the U.S. International Trade Commission and was the deputy project leader for used electronic products and examination of U.S. exports. During her 8 years at the commission, she's contributed and led several investigations on industry competitiveness, undertaking qualitative and quantitative analyses of complex topics in international trade. She holds a master's from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a bachelor's from The Ohio State University. So welcome, Andrea. And I apologize, but I'm going to have to jump out right now.
Thank you and good morning. First of all, I'll start by saying it's great to be back here at ISRI. Some of you might recall my colleague Laura and I were here last year to announce the kickoff to our investigation. and we met with several of you who were very generous with your time and expertise as we developed our survey, held our hearing, and sent out the questionnaire. So as an extra special thank you to those of you who completed the questionnaire. We know it was a bit of a burden, but we sincerely appreciate your time and couldn't have done this without you. Before I begin, just a brief introduction to the U.S. International Trade Commission for those of you who aren't familiar. We are an independent federal agency that, among other tasks, provides advice to the President and Congress on certain trade-related issues. We do not endorse policy, but serve in a fact-finding role in support of policy makers. So just briefly, I'll go through what we'll talk about today. I'll go through the USTR's request letter and the scope of the investigation. We undertook this report at the request of the United States Trade Representative as it requested primary data in support of the National Strategy for Electronic Stewardship. We'll go through the product scope of the investigation, major themes that we uncovered during our investigation, which won't be a surprise to many of you in the audience, our questionnaire and methodology, as well as the key findings, namely the who, what, when, where, and why of U.S. exports of used electronics. But I have to provide an upfront disclaimer that I will not be providing the what's next. That's a question for the United States Trade Representative's office. So we undertook this investigation at the request of USTR. They wanted some primary data on U.S. exports of used electronics, namely how much is exported. Currently, for several other commodities, for most commodities, you can identify exports and imports through data from the U.S. Department of Commerce and Census. However, with used electronic products, it's very tricky because there's no distinguishing in the trade codes between new and used products. So that necessitated the use of a questionnaire to identify these special products. We were asked to look at where it goes, what types of products and in what condition, the types of exporting and importing entities, as well as factors affecting trade. Most of you will note that environmental concerns have focused attention on U.S. exports, but are not addressed as such in this report, as we were not asked to look at those issues. The product scope of our investigation included mainly consumer and IT equipment. We did not look at standalone batteries, auto parts, or white goods and home appliances that are typically managed under schemes like the WE in the EU. In the US, these products are managed in separate end-of-life streams, so we did not include them in our analysis. So important themes that you'll note throughout the report. I left a handout at the door of a schematic graph of the industry. If you didn't grab one coming in, you might want to pick one up as you head out. It illustrates the fact that this is a highly complex industry and supply chain. You've got used electronic products originating through various channels, being collected, evaluated, repaired, broken down, and sold by a diverse group of actors. And so this network of products and actors creates a very complicated multi-transactional industry with lots of domestic and foreign sales along each step of processing. In our report, we've broken out used electronic products into two major categories, products related to repair and refurbishment, meaning that these goods will be reused again for the initial purpose of which they were designed, like a secondhand computer or cell phone. And then recycled or disassembled products that will be further processed to be broken down into primary materials for remanufacturing. To a minimal extent, there is disposal of some materials, such as your CRTs, your mercury lamps, and other hazardous materials that raise concerns. So we've paid special attention to some of these hazardous materials that are component parts of used electronic products. For example, untested and working whole equipment, circuit boards, and CRTs, to name a few. Along the lines of exporting to developing countries versus developing versus non-developing countries. We've used the distinguishing characteristic of OECD versus non-OECD that is used in some of the international legislation or rules governing such trade. So what gets exported? As I mentioned, pretty much everything along the supply chain. You have refurbished goods, tested and working, whole products intended for recycling or repair abroad, electronic component parts that are removed from semi-processed goods, as well as scrap materials from disassembled electronics, such as your metals, plastics, and glass. And we designed our survey to capture these categories of products. So again, some of you may have seen the survey that we sent out to industry. We collected 2011 data only. We didn't look at trends. We prepared a sampling frame and conducted a random sample of potential exporters in 6 specific NAICS industry codes. We believed these NAICS categories accounted for the majority of UEP-related handling and processing in the United States. And they were intended to capture brokers, recyclers, refurbishers, IT asset managers and disposition firms, OEMs, reverse logistics, and aftermarket service providers. We sent out 5,200 questionnaires to firms with greater than 10 employees, and we achieved a response rate of 57%, which is pretty remarkable for these types of surveys that we conduct. We estimate that there are roughly 1,370 exporters among processors and handlers of used electronics in the United States. One thing that you'll note in the report is that we struggled with the data collection in terms of value versus volume and weight. We looked at the whole scope of used electronic products, including refurbished computers and cell phones, as well as recycled materials. And it's difficult to get an apples-to-apples comparison of sales from someone who's refurbishing a computer, who's selling a unit. You're not going to weigh a computer before you sell it, versus someone who's shredding cell phones and is measuring a Gaylord container to be sold to a smelter or further processors. We included as much data as possible and have included the relative standard error, or RSEs, of some of our numbers, just because we wanted to include as much as possible. Some of the numbers were not as precise, but they are there for your debate and for your information. With this methodology, we extrapolated our results to the population of U.S. handlers and processors of used electronic products. In our questionnaire, and as we note in the report, there is potential to have some double counting on domestic sales. If you look at the schematic, there's lots of transactions going on, and it is possible that we caught a sale from a computer and then later on some of the component parts before they were finally processed. It's less likely that we have double counting in exports, as we only asked for firms' direct exports. So getting into the key findings, the headline numbers are that U.S. collectors and processors reported $20.6 billion in sales in used electronic products in 2011, including exports of $1.45 billion. By value, the refurbished goods are the largest share of these sales. But when you look at the weight, which I'll get to in a second, it's actually flipped. The recycled products account for a larger share by weight. Who's exporting? We broke down the exporters by primary activity, and refurbishing, repair enterprises comprise the largest share of U.S. exporters of used electronic products, followed by enterprises involved in wholesaling, brokering, or retailing. We found that roughly 1/4 of firms collecting, processing, and handling used electronics engaged in direct exporting. So what about the other 75%? We included a question on our survey asking non-exporting handlers their best guess for share of eventual exports of their products. And non-exporters estimate that 27% of non-exporters estimated that some share of their sales were eventually exported. And the rates vary. Metals recovery was particularly high, probably because, as Eric mentioned, the capacity for final smelting in the U.S. is lacking, so you see a lot of metals being exported. Some key findings, as I mentioned, whole equipment was the largest share of exports by value, while disassembled were the largest share by volume. And commodity scrap materials from disassembled used electronics made up the majority, or 91% of exports by volume, and that's your plastics and metals and glass and broken down materials. Tested and working products represented the majority of the whole exports of whole used electronic products. The other 12% was exported for repair, refurbishment, or recycling abroad. The largest share by weight, or 43%, was materials intended for further processing abroad. That's your glass, plastics, metals, and circuit boards for refining. So where are the exports going? So the top 5 destinations for U.S. exports in 2011 were Mexico, India, Hong Kong, China, and the other group of Asia-Pacific markets. Now, the terminology other Asia-Pacific markets is a bit of a stretch. For confidentiality reasons, we had to aggregate the grouping so as not to disclose the operations or the confidential business information of respondents to our questionnaire. So the other Asia-Pacific markets are namely being driven by exports to Japan and South Korea. Just over half of exports were shipped to OECD countries, 53%. The largest non-OECD countries receiving U.S. exports were India, Hong Kong, and China. You'll see there's a lot of trade going to Mexico. That's a lot of repair and refurbishment operations that we found in our questionnaire, as well as the flows to Belgium, Sweden, and Canada are being driven by flows to large smelting facilities in those countries. As well as to Asia, the primary manufacturing facilities located there have strong demand for raw materials that are coming out of recycled used electronic products. So in terms of end use, we asked questionnaire respondents to name the end use of their exports. And by far the largest share was to foreign smelters and foundries. You see 43% to materials processing, including smelting, refining, and sorting. And then 14% intended for reuse among the resale of whole equipment for further processing or for tested working products for resale. You'll note here that the numbers are now all in volume. In the final section of our questionnaire, if you were lucky enough to receive it, we asked for all the data in weight, in volume. So this is where we tried to do the apples-to-apples comparison of U.S. exports. And these numbers are largely exported, or are largely echoed in the corresponding data looking at foreign recipients of used electronic products. The largest share is to smelters and plastics reprocessors. That's over 40%, and then another 30% going to foreign refurbishers. Finally, we were asked to look at factors affecting trade in used electronics. And we asked exporters and non-exporters separately, and exporters reported that factors encouraging exports included foreign market demand, commodity prices, knowledge of foreign markets, foreign labor costs, and foreign connections. Non-exporters reported that environmental concerns, commitment to keeping work in the United States, certification requirements, transportation costs, and knowledge of foreign markets all discouraged U.S. exports. Finally, some additional factors that likely discourage exports of used electronic products. The U.S. regulations in place in 28 states have varying requirements to collectors, processors, and handlers that likely change the cost structure and increase compliance costs to firms. Certification programs require extra work to make sure the companies know their buyers and do the extra diligence, which also likely discourages exports. Finally, the Basel Convention and corresponding laws in certain foreign countries also likely depress U.S. exports. I want to point out one last thing before I conclude. In our report, if you're interested in this subject, we also included some primary shipment level data from the U.S. Census Bureau on certain discrete product groupings, including cell phones, laptops, CRTs, hard drives, and flat screen monitors. As I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, we don't have specific HTS or Schedule B codes for used products, but we evaluated some of the shipment level data on average unit value with the guess that the lower value units are going to be used products. So we provide a tabulation of shipments and country destination information on these products if you're interested. And finally, our entire full report is available online at this web address. We encourage you to check it out and take a look and to give me a call with questions. And if you have any problems or further questions, this is my contact information. Thank you. Oh, one back? Sure.
We'll leave this up here. You can write it down. We're going to have an opportunity now for asking questions of both of our speakers. I just want to let you know we're trying to manage this session to try to wrap up a little early so that you'd have an opportunity to go over to the Spotlight on Electronics, which is back at the main ballroom in Hilton. So there's a little bit of a logistics challenge here. Our afternoon electronics session will be back in this room at 2 o'clock. So now that you've heard both Andrea and Erica, let's open the floor to questions for either or both of them. There's a common theme here about export, but I think there's some unique aspects to both presentations. Well,
I was noticing that you had some comments, I'm sorry. Erica, your comments about uncertainty of international trade transports, et cetera. Have you reviewed the ITC report and adjusted your estimates and models accordingly?
Uncertainties about, I'm sorry, what was that?
Exports of used electronics products.
Well, I didn't really get into exports of used electronics from the U.S. or anything like that, but I can just point out that there is no integrated capacity in the U.S. for the smelting, processing, assembling, recycling. There is, I guess, disaggregated capacity in the U.S., and that does take place. I know I've visited facilities that will just smelt the material and then they'll ship it to either a local facility or overseas for final refining for precious metals value. But I have read that report, and I haven't really, it doesn't change the fact that that's the composition of the global market. So.
Andrea, the U.S. ITC report caught some pretty good flack from the anti-export faction, saying it only represented data that might be underreported. How would you respond to them?
Well, I have to be very careful in my remarks, but look, we were aware of our challenge from the onset, and we solicited input from as many people as possible. The ITC has expertise conducting these surveys of industry, and we did not see any anomalies in our results. If you look at some of the numbers, you'll see that we did manage to get responses from brokers and people, reporting exports of unworking products to developing countries. So we tried to be as transparent and to produce as much information as possible for the policymakers and the guys running their business. So,
I think on behalf of ISRI, I'd have to mention the reports that you've heard over the past few years about citing 80% of electronics is exported and dumped in developing countries has no relationship to the facts that are coming out of this report. It's orders of magnitude opposite. So I think there's some maybe some credibility with some real data, which is what we've been looking for. Anybody else? Okay. The Spotlight on Electronics, which Jake mentioned, is going to be a terrific session focusing on venture capital interest in this industry. It's in the main ballroom, the Orlando Ballroom at the Hilton, where the general session was held this morning. It starts at 11:30, so you've got plenty of time to wander over there. And again, this afternoon, we have a session on problem materials, handling problem materials, back here in this room at 2 o'clock. Thank you.